Now that the Civil War was over, Lincoln had a couple of really big problems on his hands, most of which involved admitting a massive population who still hated the Union and an equally massive population of former slaves who had absolutely nothing and couldn't even read, thus beginning the era of Reconstruction. Many of the things that Lincoln had in mind before he was killed he intended to accomplish by amendments of the Constitution. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, would finalize what he began with the Emancipation Proclamation in the middle of the war, as it ended all formal institutions of slavery in the United States and its territories. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, was a big one and has four main parts. The first of these is the Due Process Clause, which began the incorporation of the Bill of Rights of state governments, as it really only applied to the national government before this. The Equal Protection Clause was another important part of the 14th Amendment. It was clearly intended to protect the newly freed blacks from discrimination from the states, and did so pretty effectively. Since then, it's also been applied to all kinds of racial discrimination. The Citizenship Clause was another important aspect of the amendment, and it aimed to protect blacks by declaring who was legally a citizen of the country, and that states were not able to infringe upon this right without due process. The fourth primary clause of the amendment is the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which was yet another provision aimed at protecting the civil rights and liberties and equality of all citizens. This amendment was really meant to guarantee equality to African Americans, and since its ratification has been very important in extending equal rights to all Americans. Thirdly and lastly, the 15th Amendment further protected the rights of African Americans by attempting to ensure that all citizens could vote without being discriminated on any account of race, though women still could not vote.
Slavery was discontinued in the United States in 1865 with the signing of the 13th Amendment. Although slavery was eradicated, the South found new ways to get workers for cheap. Sharecropping was a new practice introduced, where a landlord would give a piece of land to a cropper to grow crops on. The cropper would buy seeds from the owner and rent farming materials as well. There was an incredibly high interest rate that kept the workers in debt for their life, which carried over generation to generation. The South also created the Black Codes during the time of Reconstruction. The Black Codes limited the freedom of African Americans, such as the right to vote and serve on juries. Some states even forced blacks to sign labor contracts every year and risked harm if they did not. Some of these issues were resolved with the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which ruled all men were equal and prohibited racial discrimination. Unfortunately, this was later ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1883, and they were back to square one.
2 months before the end of the war, Congress created a Freedmen's Bureau to assist in Reconstruction in former rebel states, in certain border states, and in Washington, D.C. The agents of this bureau were essentially social workers, specifically helping former slaves. They provided education, they provided healthcare, they provided legal services, and they provided many other services. Now, in spite of a bunch of opposition in the South from whites and extreme understaffing, this organization was extremely useful during the Reconstruction. However, it was temporary, and it was only meant to last 1 year after the end of the war. Despite lasting longer due to Congress extending its tenure, it still only lasted until 1872 when it was ultimately. The term carpetbagger was used to describe Northerners who, after the war, moved down south in order to buy and lease plantations or in order to make a profit off cotton. Originally welcoming these Northerners, Southerners grew to hate them, viewing them as low-class opportunists who did nothing but made wealth at the misfortunes of others. This led to the name carpetbagger, which was originally used to describe somebody who arrived in a new region with nothing but a carpetbagger knapsack and went on to make fortunes at the expense of the original inhabitants. In contrast, however, most of these alleged carpetbaggers were really just middle-class people who desired nothing more but to make an honest living and to reform the South in the image of the North to provide a more equal society for African Americans. The word scalawag was used to describe white Southern Republicans. During the war, these Republicans generally either joined the Union Army or they were imprisoned for holding Union sentiments, and most lived in the southern border states. Though many still disliked blacks, they held the common goal of preventing the rebels from rising again, along with ensuring the survival of small farmers and yeomen. These scalawags held considerable power, composing about 20% of the white electorate. The term scalawag was coined by their opponents, who held them lower than carpetbaggers. The term originally meant useless animals or people. Alright, so here's how this works. One of my group members gave me a random question. The answer is in this box, but if I get it right, I don't have to do anything. And if I get it wrong, I have to eat a handful of these, and these are nasty. They're like vomit flavored, stinky socks flavored, moldy cheese. You get the gist. I don't know why I'm doing this, because most of you are probably only paying enough attention to answer the questions, but whatever. The question is, who was Andrew Johnson's vice president? don't know, I guess Charles Sumner. It's no one.
Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, less than a week after the South's surrender at Ford's Theater, by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. This was extremely detrimental to the hope of long-lasting reform in the future, as nobody was able to grasp the nation quite like Honest Abe, as many of the racial discriminations and disenfranchisement of blacks continued to plague the South. In the time period directly after the war, several radical and white supremacist secret societies were formed all across the political South in order to induce fear in freed blacks and some white reformers.
Into the white supremacist to lick my big toe.
Through terror and violence. The most popular of these aforementioned groups was the Ku Klux Klan, or KKK, who were founded by ex-Confederate General Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, who became the first Grand Wizard of the KKK. The KKK were particularly efficient in striking fear upon blacks, as they were commonly known to lynch blacks, burn down black housings, and stop freed blacks from even voting. They amassed quite a large group of supporters, and even though Congress began attacking the supremacist group by passing the Force Acts of 1870 and 1871, we only saw their influence peak to as much as an estimated 8 million racists in the early 20th century. The Compromise of 1877 was an informal agreement between Democrats and Republicans to appoint Republican President Rutherford B. Hayes to become president in exchange for funding a Southern Transcontinental Railroad, as well as the end for troops in the South. This marked the end of the Reconstruction era, as no change would progress past that point.
Andrew Johnson assumed the role of president after the assassination of President Lincoln. Johnson ran as Lincoln's vice president during the election of 1864. Johnson was a Southern Democrat, so one of his primary focuses when he came into office was the reconstruction of the Southern states. Many Republicans thought he was too lenient in his approach to Reconstruction with the Southern states. In 1866, Johnson vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Bill. Both were legislation focused on protecting African Americans in the South. Reconstruction can be seen as a success because it helped rebuild the infrastructure of the South after it had been destroyed by the Union Army. It also helped get the South's economy back on its feet after the war. However, many people see Reconstruction as a failure because of President Johnson's leniency towards the South. His leniency allowed for the creation of black codes and suppressed blacks in the South. The KKK rose to power in the South due to his lenience with the Southern states. The KKK targeted blacks and white Republicans who were seeking election in the South.